My own son looked me in the eyes on his wedding day and quietly said, "Mom, the guests are important. Could you please eat in the kitchen?" I smiled so he wouldn't feel embarrassed, but seconds later, one of America's most powerful billionaires walked into the reception, saw me standing alone with a paper plate, and loudly called me, "Mom." The entire ballroom went completely silent. Before we dive into it, tell me in the comments where you're from. I love seeing the different places people tune in from. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. My name is Maren Hale, and I never imagined the happiest day of my son's life would become the most painful day of mine. I was widowed young and spent the next 30 years raising my only son, Nico, alone. I worked double shifts, skipped vacations, sold precious family heirlooms, and sacrificed every personal dream so he could attend law school and build the future he deserved. Watching him succeed made every hardship feel worthwhile. When Nico announced he was marrying Camille Rowan, the elegant daughter of wealthy real estate developer Dalton Rowan, I was genuinely happy for him. I bought the nicest dress I could afford and arrived at the beautiful ballroom excited to celebrate. But from the moment I walked through the doors, Camille's family looked at me as though I didn't belong. Their polite smiles had obvious judgment, yet I ignored every slight because I refused to let anything ruin my son's special day. I kept reminding myself that love mattered more than pride. I had no idea that before the evening ended, everyone in that ballroom would discover the truth about the woman they had so easily dismissed. As the reception continued, the distance between me and everyone else became impossible to ignore. Camille's mother, Faye Rowan, wore a pleasant smile, but every compliment carried a hidden insult. She casually remarked that my dress looked simple for such an elegant venue, asked whether my necklace had sentimental value because it certainly wasn't expensive, and gently corrected my table manners in front of nearby guests. Each comment was delivered so politely that no one could openly accuse her of being rude, yet the message was unmistakable: I wasn't considered good enough for their family. Nico heard every word. Our eyes met more than once, and I could tell he knew exactly what was happening. Still, he said nothing. He seemed terrified that defending me would create tension with his future in-laws on his wedding day. During the family photographs, I was quietly moved farther and farther toward the edge until I was barely visible. A few guests even assumed I was an elderly family friend or a distant relative instead of the groom's mother. I smiled through every awkward moment, convincing myself weddings brought stress and emotions that made people act differently. Deep inside, though, I couldn't stop remembering the years I skipped meals, worked overtime, and sacrificed every comfort so Nico could afford private tutoring and eventually law school. I never expected praise or recognition, but I had hoped not to feel invisible. Even with my heart breaking, I refused to argue or embarrass my son. I believed protecting his happiness was still more important than defending my own pride. As dinner was about to be served, guests began finding their assigned seats while waiters carried elegant meals across the ballroom. I noticed a quiet conversation between Faye and several event coordinators before she glanced in my direction with clear disapproval. A moment later, Nico slowly walked toward me. His expression was uneasy, and he avoided looking directly into my eyes. In a soft voice, he explained that a few unexpected investors had arrived and needed seats at the front tables. Then he hesitated before asking, "Mom, would you mind eating in the kitchen with the catering staff, just this once?" Those few words hurt more than every insult I had endured that afternoon. The little boy I had raised with endless love was asking me to disappear so no one important would feel inconvenienced. I forced a smile because I didn't want to make his wedding more difficult than it already was. Quietly picking up my plate, I walked through the swinging doors into the service hallway. The cooks and servers greeted me with genuine kindness, quickly making space for me at a small table. Unlike the guests outside, they treated me with warmth instead of judgment. I thanked them and sat down, pretending everything was fine while fighting back tears. I kept telling myself that if swallowing my pride allowed Nico to enjoy his wedding without conflict, then it was a sacrifice I could still make. Beyond the kitchen doors, music filled the ballroom and glasses clinked in celebration. Meanwhile, the groom's own mother ate alone in the back, hoping no one would notice where she had been sent. Just as the servers prepared to bring out dessert, the atmosphere inside the ballroom suddenly shifted. Conversations grew quieter as heads turned toward the entrance. An unexpected guest had arrived. Dorian Voss, one of America's most respected billionaire investors, had stepped into the reception. He was known for keeping an extremely private life and almost never attended social events unless they were deeply important to him. His presence alone was enough to make the room buzz with excitement. Dalton Rowan immediately hurried across the ballroom with a broad smile, followed closely by Faye, both eager to welcome such an influential guest. They proudly introduced themselves and began speaking about business, clearly hoping this surprise visit might open the door to a valuable partnership. Around them, guests admired Dorian from a distance, whispering about his success and wondering why he had chosen to attend this wedding. Dorian greeted everyone with quiet courtesy, shaking hands and offering polite smiles, but his attention seemed elsewhere. As he slowly looked around the ballroom, his expression suddenly changed. The pleasant smile disappeared, replaced by a look of confusion and concern. His eyes moved past the decorated tables, elegant gowns, and powerful executives until they settled on the partially open kitchen doors. Through the doorway, he spotted an older woman standing alone beside a small service table, quietly clearing away her paper plate after finishing her meal. He stared for a brief moment as if recognizing someone he hadn't expected to see. Without another word to Dalton or Faye, Dorian calmly turned away from the crowd and began walking directly toward the kitchen, leaving the entire ballroom watching in puzzled silence. Ignoring every attempt to stop him, Dorian continued walking past the head table and the crowd of influential guests. Politicians, business leaders, and longtime associates waited to greet him, but he acknowledged none of them. Confused whispers spread across the ballroom as everyone watched one of America's wealthiest men head toward the service hallway instead of the celebration. Dalton called after him, assuming he had taken a wrong turn, but Dorian never slowed his pace. He reached the kitchen entrance and found me placing my empty paper plate beside a sink, trying not to disturb the catering staff. For a brief moment, he simply looked at me with a mixture of surprise and sadness. Then his face softened into a warm smile I hadn't seen in years. In a clear voice that carried through the silent room, he said, "Mom, why are you eating back here?" Every conversation stopped instantly. The music faded into the background as dozens of stunned faces turned toward us. I looked at him in complete disbelief before recognizing the familiar kindness in his eyes. My own eyes filled with tears as I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around him. He returned the hug without hesitation, as though no time had passed between us. Across the ballroom, Nico nearly dropped the glass he was holding. Camille stood speechless while Faye and Dalton stared in open shock, unable to understand what they were witnessing. The guests exchanged confused glances, wondering how the quiet woman they had ignored all evening could possibly share such a close bond with a billionaire. In that single moment, the entire atmosphere of the wedding changed. Still holding my hand, Dorian turned toward the silent crowd and smiled gently before explaining why he had called me Mom. He told everyone that many years earlier, long before anyone knew his name, he had lost both of his parents within a short period. As a frightened teenager with nowhere to go, he entered the foster care system carrying little more than a small duffel bag and the fear that no one would ever truly care about him again. At that time, I was working as an overworked social worker, doing my best to help children facing impossible situations. Although I was only assigned as Dorian's temporary guardian, I treated him as if he were my own son from the very first day. I listened when he felt hopeless, encouraged him when he doubted himself, and reminded him that his future would never be defined by his circumstances. I celebrated every small success because I believed he was capable of achieving great things, even when he couldn't see it himself. Eventually, he left foster care and built a remarkable career, creating the technology company that would later make him one of America's most successful entrepreneurs. Through every achievement, he never forgot the woman who had believed in him before anyone else did. Looking directly at the guests, Dorian said that family wasn't always created by blood but by the people who stood beside you when life was at its darkest. The room fell into an emotional silence. Several guests wiped away tears, while Nico stood frozen, struggling to understand that his mother had quietly changed another person's life without ever expecting recognition. The ballroom was still silent when Dorian revealed another truth that no one had expected to hear. Looking directly at Nico, he explained that their connection had never ended after he built his company. Over the years, he had stayed in touch with me, always grateful for the kindness I had shown him when he had nothing. Then he shared a secret I had carefully protected for years. Every major scholarship that eased Nico's tuition, every anonymous donation that arrived when expenses became overwhelming, and every emergency investment that kept his educational dreams alive had come from Dorian. None of it had happened by chance. I had reached out only when there was no other option, never asking for money for myself, only for opportunities that would allow my son to keep moving forward. Dorian admitted that he had offered to tell Nico the truth several times, but I refused every single time. I wanted my son to believe that his success belonged to him alone. I never wanted gratitude to become a burden or make him feel that his accomplishments were purchased instead of earned through hard work. As Dorian finished speaking, Nico's expression changed from confusion to heartbreak. Memories of unexpected financial relief during law school suddenly made sense. The tuition assistance, the timely support, and the opportunities he had accepted without question were all connected to the quiet sacrifices his mother had continued making behind the scenes. He realized that even after giving up so much of her own life, she had still been protecting his future without asking for recognition. The weight of that realization left him speechless as guilt settled heavily over him. The atmosphere in the ballroom changed almost instantly. Dalton Rowan, who had barely acknowledged me earlier, suddenly stepped forward with an exaggerated smile. He praised my kindness, spoke about the importance of family, and claimed they had always admired my humility. Faye quickly joined him, offering an apology wrapped in carefully chosen words. She insisted that if anything she had said sounded disrespectful, it had been misunderstood. Camille forced a nervous smile and tried to explain that asking me to eat in the kitchen had simply been an unfortunate seating issue caused by unexpected guests. She insisted no one had intended to hurt my feelings. Their sudden change in attitude was so obvious that even people standing nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Before I could respond, Dorian calmly raised his hand. His voice remained steady, but every word carried weight. He said that kindness shown only after discovering someone's influence was not kindness at all. Real respect, he explained, is measured by how people treat those they believe have nothing to offer in return. If a person's value changes the moment wealth or power enters the conversation, then the respect was never genuine to begin with. His words echoed through the silent ballroom, leaving no room for excuses. Several guests slowly nodded in agreement, while others looked away, embarrassed by what they had witnessed throughout the evening. Dalton's confident expression faded, and Faye could no longer hide her discomfort. Camille stood quietly, realizing that no explanation could erase what everyone had already seen. The polished reputation the Rowans had spent years building was beginning to crack before the eyes of their friends, business associates, and respected members of the community. Desperate to regain control of the situation, Dalton forced a smile and shifted the conversation toward business. He laughed awkwardly and reminded Dorian about the investment proposal his company had submitted weeks earlier. Confident that their relationship could still be repaired, he suggested they discuss the partnership after the wedding reception. Several executives standing nearby listened carefully, expecting the uncomfortable moment to pass. Instead, Dorian calmly reached into his briefcase and removed a thin folder. Without raising his voice, he explained that his investment committee had already completed a thorough review of the Rowan Group before today's event. Their investigation had uncovered a pattern of troubling behavior that extended far beyond what had happened at the wedding. Reports described repeated mistreatment of employees, questionable financial disclosures, and business practices that raised serious concerns about the company's integrity. Dorian said his firm invested in people as much as profits, and character always mattered more than impressive numbers on a balance sheet. Because of those findings, every pending agreement, financing discussion, and future investment opportunity involving Dalton's company had been permanently cancelled before he had even arrived at the reception. The folder contained the official decision, already signed and finalized. A heavy silence settled over the ballroom. Business leaders exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had just witnessed a major financial relationship collapse in real time. Dalton's face lost its color as the reality sank in. The deal he had spent months pursuing had disappeared in a matter of seconds, taking millions of dollars in potential funding with it. For the first time that evening, he understood that arrogance and a lack of integrity could carry a price no amount of money could erase. As the silence lingered, Nico looked at me in a way he hadn't all day. Standing beside Dorian, I wasn't the woman who had been quietly pushed aside anymore. I was simply his mother, the person who had spent a lifetime putting him before herself. Memories began flooding his mind one after another. He remembered the nights I came home exhausted from work but still helped him study, the birthdays when I insisted I didn't need gifts so he could have what he wanted, and the countless times I told him everything would be alright even when I wasn't sure how we would pay the bills. For years, I had carried every burden without asking for anything in return. Yet on the day that should have honored our family, he had asked me to disappear. Tears filled his eyes as the weight of that decision settled on his heart. Slowly, he walked across the ballroom until he stood in front of me. With every guest watching, he admitted that he had failed the one person who had never failed him. He apologized for staying silent while others insulted me and for asking me to eat in the kitchen instead of standing proudly by his side. His voice shook with genuine regret, and for a moment the room remained completely still. I gently took his hands and told him I accepted his apology because he was my son and I would always love him. But I also reminded him that broken trust isn't repaired in a single conversation. Forgiveness can begin with honest words, but rebuilding a relationship requires consistent actions, patience, and the courage to make different choices every single day. The emotional moment between Nico and me should have brought peace to the room, but instead it exposed deeper problems that could no longer be ignored. Camille's expression hardened as she watched the guests whisper among themselves. Embarrassed by everything that had happened, she turned her frustration toward Nico. In a voice that everyone nearby could hear, she accused him of humiliating her parents by apologizing in front of their friends and business associates. She argued that he should have defended the Rowans instead of making them look heartless. Nico stared at her in disbelief, unable to understand how she could still be focused on protecting appearances after everything that had been revealed. Their disagreement quickly grew into an honest conversation about values they had avoided discussing throughout their relationship. Camille insisted that public image and family reputation were essential, especially among influential people. Nico finally admitted that he had spent too much of his life trying to impress others while ignoring the person who had sacrificed everything for him. The difference between them had never been clearer. Around the ballroom, guests quietly gathered their belongings and slipped toward the exits, uncomfortable witnessing what had become far more than a wedding celebration. The music stopped, conversations faded, and the once joyful atmosphere disappeared completely. Dalton and Faye stood in silence, unable to repair the damage unfolding before them. Watching Camille refuse to acknowledge any responsibility made Nico question everything they had built together. For the first time, he wondered if he was about to marry someone who valued status, wealth, and appearances more than honesty, compassion, and the people who had always stood beside him when nothing else mattered. After the last of the guests had quietly drifted away, Nico asked Camille to speak with him in a private room away from the ballroom. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. He hoped they could still find some common ground, but every question he asked only confirmed how far apart they had grown. Camille remained focused on the embarrassment her family had suffered and insisted that everything would have been fine if he had simply stood by the Rowans. She never acknowledged the pain my humiliation had caused or accepted responsibility for asking me to sit in the kitchen. Nico realized that ignoring those differences would only create a marriage built on resentment instead of trust. With a heavy heart, he made the most difficult decision of his life. Before the marriage certificate was signed, he quietly informed the officiant that the wedding would not continue. News spread quickly through the remaining guests. Camille left the venue in tears, while Dalton and Faye blamed everyone except themselves for the collapse of the ceremony. I found Nico sitting alone, overwhelmed by grief and disappointment. Even after everything that had happened, I sat beside him and reminded him that one painful decision did not define the rest of his life. Dorian soon joined us, placing a reassuring hand on Nico's shoulder. He told him that walking away from the wrong future often creates space for the right one, even when the choice feels unbearable in the moment. For the first time in many years, Nico and I spoke openly without fear, excuses, or pride standing between us. It wasn't the ending we expected, but it was the beginning of healing our family. Several months passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Nico understood that rebuilding trust would take more than apologies, so he focused on proving through his actions that he had truly changed. He visited me often, not out of obligation but because he genuinely wanted to spend time together. He also began volunteering at community legal clinics, offering free legal guidance to working families who could not afford an attorney. Listening to their struggles reminded him of everything I had quietly endured while raising him alone. Each person he helped deepened his appreciation for the sacrifices that had shaped his own future. I never asked him to make these changes, but seeing his compassion grow meant more than any words he could have spoken. Dorian remained a constant part of our lives, treating me as family just as he always had. He frequently invited me to company gatherings, charity dinners, and employee appreciation events. At those occasions, he never introduced me by my accomplishments or financial status. Instead, he proudly told people that I was the woman who had taught him the importance of kindness, resilience, and believing in others. Unlike the wedding reception, where I had been hidden behind kitchen doors, these events welcomed me with warmth and genuine respect. People listened to my stories, thanked me for the influence I had on Dorian's life, and made me feel seen without expecting anything in return. I had never wanted attention or recognition. Knowing that the people around me valued character over wealth was enough. Watching Nico become a better man was the greatest reward I could have ever received, and it gave me hope for the future. Looking back on everything that happened, I realized the deepest wound wasn't being asked to eat in the kitchen. It was the painful belief that all the years of love, sacrifice, and quiet devotion had been forgotten by the person I loved most. For a brief moment, I wondered whether any of it had truly mattered. But life has a remarkable way of revealing the truth when people least expect it. The respect I eventually received didn't come from wealth, influence, or knowing a billionaire. Those things simply uncovered what had always been true. My value had never depended on the opinions of people who judged others by appearances. It had always been found in the choices I made, the compassion I showed, and the lives I helped shape. Dorian's public acknowledgement didn't change who I was, it only allowed everyone else to see the woman they had overlooked. Nico also learned a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Professional success, social status, and ambition mean very little if achieving them requires forgetting the people who stood beside you during your hardest days. He understood that honoring family isn't something you postpone until it's convenient. As for the Rowans, they discovered that treating someone as unimportant can carry consequences far beyond embarrassment or financial loss. A person's character is revealed by how they treat those who seem unable to offer anything in return. In the end, I never needed revenge. Truth spoke louder than anger ever could, gratitude proved stronger than pride, and integrity exposed every mask without me having to seek justice myself. That was the greatest victory of all.